The winters of the 1800s knew no mercy. The snow buried not only the landscape but secrets as well. In the mountains of Wyoming, where the howling of wolves was the only song, an innocent soul's vitality was fading minute by minute. What is cruelty to a human is just another sacrifice to the wilderness. But sometimes the will to live and an unexpected encounter rewrite the book of fate. This story is about how when all hope seems lost, the wilderness may still hold one last chance. The caravan from Montana had been struggling with the deepening snow for 14 days. The once hopeful faces of the settlers had now turned into frozen masks. Every breath meant pain, every step a struggle. The wagon wheels kept getting stuck in the deep snow, and the animals' strength was running out. At 25, Martha Sinclair was far from the image painted of the hardened women of the Wild West. Her brown hair framed her pale face like thin threads, while her frail figure was covered by a too-thin coat bought in Boston. Her long fingers once danced on piano keys, now cracked and red, proving she wasn't made for this world. After her husband's death, she joined the Westbound group because she had no other choice. Jacob Sinclair's gold fever had consumed not only his inheritance, but his wife's as well. When he died in a mine collapse, Martha was left with nothing but debt and shame. The West promised a new beginning, perhaps a teaching position in California. The caravan leader, Bill Harrison, was an insufferable man, a former cattle driver who treated people like animals. He particularly despised the weak. In his eyes, city women were nothing but a burden, slowing progress and consuming supplies. And Martha somehow always ended up in his way. On that fateful dawn, the temperature dropped even lower than usual. The horse's breath swirled like white clouds in the air. Harrison was several days behind schedule and impatiently urged them to move forward. She ignored the elders' request to wait for more favorable weather. Food was running low, and she didn't want to get stranded in the mountains if another storm broke out. That morning, Martha felt worse than usual. She had been suffering from a cough for days. The medicines she'd carried since Boston had run out, which is why she noticed the bee flower growing beside the path, which her grandmother had taught her could ease lung pain. She fell behind to gather some, and a tree trunk hid her from the caravan. Only when she was gathering the plants from the snow did she notice she could no longer hear the creaking of the wagons. Perhaps just a change in wind direction, she thought. But when she straightened up, she saw the last wagon of the departing caravan already half a mile away. Martha shouted, waved, then started running after the tracks. Every step in the deep snow was torture. Her lungs burned, her legs grew heavy. After 20 minutes, she had to stop to catch her breath. By then, the caravan had disappeared behind the next bend. Her desperation grew when she noticed another snowstorm approaching. The clouds hung low, and the wind was already carrying snow. She knew the tracks would soon be covered by a new layer of snow. Martha didn't give up. She continued on, following the tracks while they were visible. She struggled for hours as the snowstorm intensified. By afternoon, she could barely see ahead. The wind lashed at her face. The snow soaked through her clothes. The cold began to penetrate to her bones. By nightfall, she knew she would have to spend the night in the wilderness. A fallen pine tree provided some shelter. Her gloved fingers clumsily tried to strike a fire, as she had seen her father do in childhood. After 20 unsuccessful attempts, she surrendered to the frost. With a trembling body, she huddled under the tree, waiting for morning that might never come for her. Dawn brought no relief. The storm had passed, but the temperature continued to drop. Martha set out again with stiffened limbs, though she could no longer see any tracks. She could only hope she was heading in the right direction. By noon, she had to find another shelter, a rocky outcrop that protected her from the wind. She retrieved her spare provisions, a dried piece of bread and some dried meat. She knew she had to ration them. Who knows how long she would be alone? Her thoughts wandered to her husband. Jacob was a weak man, but he loved her in his own way. If he were alive, would he be looking for her now? Or would he have abandoned her too, like the caravan? Martha knew the answer, and it hurt more than the cold. That evening, another storm swept across the landscape. Martha found shelter in a small, cave-like hollow. Her fingers were so frozen she could barely unbutton her bag. Wrapped in her only blanket, she tried to find warmth. In her dreams, she saw her mother asking her to hold on a little longer. By the end of the second day, Martha knew she was in trouble. Her food supplies were dwindling, her strength leaving her. Her legs wouldn't obey properly, and a strange numbness spread through her body. The afternoon sun's light broke through ice crystals, painting spectacular colors across the landscape. Martha stopped to admire it. If this was the last beautiful thing she would see, at least it was gorgeous. That evening she couldn't find proper shelter. She huddled under a pine tree, listening to the distant howling of wolves. She wasn't afraid of them. Somehow the thought that she wasn't alone in this white hell was comforting. The third day was only about survival. Martha knew every step counted. If she stopped, she might never start again. She dragged her feet through the snow like a living dead. Her lips were so chapped they bled when she tried to drink from the snow. Toward evening, she found some shelter by a frozen stream. She took out her diary and with trembling hands wrote her final lines, intended for her sister if anyone ever found her body. She apologized for not returning as promised, asked her not to mourn too long, and most importantly, never to head west chasing a dream. On the dawn of the fourth day, Martha no longer felt the cold. She knew this was a bad sign. The doctor's father always said that when frostbite stops hurting, that's when the end comes. A strange peace came over her. Perhaps dying like this isn't so bad, she thought. To be part of nature, to return to the earth from which all life originates. By afternoon, she was hallucinating. She talked with long-dead relatives, laughed at memories she had almost forgotten. She saw her childhood home, smelled freshly baked bread. Deep down, she knew these images were the mind's final gifts before giving up. That night in her dream, she heard her mother's voice calling her. Martha knew she had to move toward the voice, but for some reason she couldn't get up. When she opened her eyes, the face of a man with a rough beard wearing leather clothes was leaning over her. She was sure she was still hallucinating, but the man held hot soup to her lips, and the hot liquid burned her throat. This sensation was too real to be a dream. Ezra Jenkins had lived in the wilderness for 25 years. After losing his family in a Missouri riverboat accident, he turned his back on civilization. He was only 17 then, a boy who became a man overnight. The pain nearly drove him mad, but the wilderness slowly provided healing for his wounds. He sought only the company of trees and animals. He made his living as a woodcutter, securing his modest livelihood by selling timber to traders. His cabin stood in the valley, far from settlements and trails. He wasn't afraid of solitude, rather welcomed it as a friend. The silence didn't oppress him, but cleared his thoughts. Over the years, he learned all the secrets of the wilderness, how to survive harsh winters, how to find food even in the hardest times. That morning, a strange restlessness came over him. He couldn't explain it, but he felt something had changed in the usual order. He set out hunting, although he still had plenty of meat. Something led him in a direction different from his usual route, as if an invisible hand was guiding his steps. This is how he found Martha, half buried in snow, barely breathing. When he first saw her, he thought it was too late, but something made him check. Perhaps a slight movement of air, perhaps just hope. He knelt beside her and felt the weak breathing. He didn't hesitate. He wrapped the woman in his coat and started toward his cabin. The journey was long and difficult. Ezra felt time working against him. The woman's body had cooled dangerously, her skin taking on a bluish tint. He had to stop several times to check if she was still breathing. He talked to her, though he knew she couldn't hear. He told stories about the mountains, the animals, anything that came to mind, just to keep her alive. By the time he reached his cabin, his own strength was nearly depleted. But he couldn't rest. He lit a fire, boiled water, and took out his herbs. Ezra didn't believe in coincidences, and this surely wasn't one. Martha's recovery progressed slowly. In the first days, Ezra feared she would lose some fingers to frostbite. Her frozen fingers and toes ached painfully as life returned to them. Ezra prepared herbal compresses with practiced movements, which he had learned from a Cherokee woman years ago. He spoke little, only what was necessary. Martha couldn't tell if this was the man's nature or if long solitude had made him taciturn. During the first week, Martha mostly slept. In her dreams, she relived the pain of abandonment, the caravan that left without her. Harrison's mocking smile when he told her a month earlier that city folk weren't meant for the West. Perhaps he was right. Martha now faced for the first time that she might never see civilization again. Ezra sometimes heard her crying but didn't ask questions. He knew wounds heal when left alone. Instead, he prepared fresh meat broth and sat quietly by the bed while she ate. Sometimes he read to her from the few books he kept, old stories, legends of peoples he had heard from his Indian friends. His voice calmed Martha, although she often didn't understand the words. As days passed, Martha's strength slowly returned. She now spent longer periods awake and began to discover her refuge. Ezra's cabin was simple but had everything one might need. It consisted of a single large room with an iron stove in the middle that radiated pleasant warmth. In one corner was the bed where she lay, in the other Ezra's bedding, nothing more than a straw mattress. Wooden shelves were laden with preserved meats and canned foods. The man had prepared for winter like a good steward. The hand-carved furniture was beautiful in its simplicity. Everything testified to the work of the man's own hands. The small details, a carefully carved pattern on the table leg, revealed that for Ezra, beauty was not a luxury but a natural part of life. From the window, Martha could see the snowy landscape, the snow-covered pines, and in the distance, the outline of mountains. The view was breathtaking, like a painting. Martha understood why this man had chosen this life. Here, everything was real, honest, and pure. When Martha was able to get up, she marveled at the wild beauty of the landscape surrounding the cabin. Huge pine trees stood guard over the clearing, and in the distance, snow-capped peaks rose toward the sky. In the evening, wolf howls broke the silence, but she wasn't afraid beside Ezra. He explained that wolves rarely attack humans, and if you respect their territory, they leave you alone. One day, Ezra showed her his workshop, a smaller building next to the cabin. This is where he made his tools and worked the wood. Martha admired the simple yet effective tools. In Ezra's hands, the axe seemed like an artistic instrument as he shaped wood with just a few cuts. 2 weeks passed. Martha tried to repay the care with small household chores. She cleaned the cabin, organized the shelves, and after breakfast washed the dishes in water melted from snow. Ezra let her, though it was clear he wasn't used to help. For the first time in his life, someone else was taking care of him, and this feeling was new to him. In the evenings they sat by the fire and slowly opened up to each other. Martha talked about her life in Boston, the social events, the music she loved so much. She spoke of her unfortunate marriage to a man consumed by gold fever, who was rarely by her side and lost his life in the first mine. She talked about the disappointment when she discovered her husband had gambled away or drunk all their money. Ezra shared his own story rarely and in fragments, but Martha still knew more about him than anyone else in 20 years. He spoke of his family, his mother who always sang while working, his father who was strict but fair, and his little sister who always collected flowers. He talked about the shipwreck, the water that took everything from him, and how he found peace in the wilderness. A strange friendship developed between them. Two lonely souls whom fate or chance had brought together. Two people who lived differently, thought differently, yet understood each other. One evening, Martha asked what would happen to her in spring. The question had been hovering between them for days, but neither dared to speak it. Martha knew she couldn't stay forever. She had to return to civilization, continue her journey no matter how difficult. Ezra stared at the fire for a long time before answering. "I can take you to Fort Laramie once the roads become passable. From there, a stagecoach heads east if you want to return." The words hung heavily in the air. Martha's heart tightened. She had to return to civilization, but nothing awaited her there. The cabin had slowly become home to her. The thought of being among strangers again, in the noise of cities, suddenly seemed more frightening than the dangers of the wilderness. In the following days, Martha felt something had changed between them. Ezra's gaze followed her as she moved about the cabin. They sought each other's company, though they barely spoke. There were moments when Martha wished the man would say what he was thinking. Other times she was grateful for the silence that didn't force her to make a decision. Around midwinter, Martha became feverish again, perhaps from the cold, or perhaps as a delayed effect of her earlier hardships. Ezra sat beside her for days, applying compresses to her forehead and wrestling with his own fears. He was terrified of losing his only companion who had brought light to his lonely life. He was no longer caring for her out of duty, but because he couldn't imagine life without Martha. In the depths of her fever dreams, Martha understood that her feelings were more than gratitude. In this rough-looking man of few words, she found more than in any well-mannered Boston gentleman. A soul who wasn't afraid of solitude, yet made room for another. A person who proved his worth not through words, but through actions. One morning, when Martha's fever subsided, Ezra disappeared. Only a short message remained on the wooden table saying he went hunting and would return soon. Martha's heart tightened with the familiar feeling of loneliness. She feared the man wouldn't return, wanting to rid himself of his burden. Perhaps he realized the woman had feelings for him, and this frightened him. 3 days passed, and Martha watched the forest edge with increasing desperation. Perhaps he had an accident. Perhaps he deliberately left her. These thoughts tormented her while she tried to maintain the cabin. She cleaned, fetched water, made fire, as if these actions could ensure the man's return. The third evening was particularly cold. The wind howled between the trees and snow began falling again. Martha sat by the window, staring into the darkness. She reminded herself that Ezra was an experienced survivor who knew the wilderness. But fear wouldn't listen to reason. On the 4th day, Martha decided to go looking for Ezra. Although she was still weak and barely knew the area, she couldn't bear the uncertainty anymore. She put on thick layers of his clothes and carved a stick for support. She packed food and took a small knife that Ezra used for carving. She had barely taken 100 steps when she spotted Ezra at the edge of the forest. A huge deer carcass rested on his shoulder, and days of exhaustion showed on his face. There were bloodstains on his clothes, his face and beard covered with tiny ice crystals. When he saw the woman standing outside the cabin, his steps quickened. Martha burst into tears. A wave of relief almost swept her away. Then her anger erupted, and a torrent of words poured from her. All her fears, uncertainties, and the pain of the past months burst forth at once. Her words cut like sharp knives through the frozen air. How could he think he could just disappear? How could he leave her in uncertainty? Just like the caravan. Ezra stood and listened. He let the woman say what she needed to. He didn't defend himself, didn't interrupt. When Martha finally fell silent, with only sobs shaking her body, Ezra put down the deer and stepped toward her. He simply embraced her and said only this, "I came back. I always will." Martha buried her face in his coat and let his presence calm her. In that moment, she understood that this man would never intentionally leave her alone. Perhaps this was the greatest gift she could have received. That evening, something changed between them. Martha learned that trust lies not in words but in actions. And Ezra learned that solitude was no longer a choice but a burden for him. Winter slowly loosened its grip. The first snowdrops bloomed in the valley, signaling the approaching spring. The days grew longer, and the snow began to retreat from the northern slopes. Martha grew stronger day by day. She now helped with daily tasks, learned how to set traps, make fire, and even wielded an axe skillfully. Ezra was a patient teacher. He showed her how to recognize edible plants, how to read animal tracks, and how to predict weather changes. Martha drank in knowledge thirstily. Never in her life had she felt so useful, so alive. The lonely woodcutter and the girl from the city slowly, almost imperceptibly, drew closer to each other. There were no grand confessions, only small signs. A touch by the fire, a smile during shared work, a glance that lingered longer than necessary. Both were afraid to speak what they felt, because that would be irreversible. One evening, Ezra took out a carefully preserved book. Pressed flowers rested between its wrinkled pages. Martha carefully turned the yellowing pages. Inside were children's drawings, a lock of hair held by a ribbon, and a family photo that was barely discernible. This was all he had saved from his family. Martha gently leafed through it and understood why this man had chosen solitude. He didn't want to shut himself away, but to protect his heart from another loss. That evening, Martha told a story from her own life. On his deathbed, her father told her to never be afraid to start anew. Life sometimes takes away, but always gives something in return. One just needs to walk with open eyes to notice the gift. At the end of March, when the paths became passable again, Ezra brought up the question of Fort Laramie again. He felt obligated to offer the possibility, though inside he dreaded her answer. Martha struggled for days. She knew she had to decide. The cabin offered security, but would it be enough for a lifetime? Life here was hard, the winter cruel. Every day was a fight for survival. But something about it seemed more genuine than the city's glitter and superficial relationships. That night, clear moonlight illuminated the valley. Martha stepped out of the cabin and breathed in deeply the pine-scented air. In her mind, she bid farewell to her previous life, to comfort, social events, and a secure future. Then she looked back at the cabin, where Ezra watched her, leaning against the doorframe. His face was particularly serious in the moonlight, but in his eyes, Martha saw hope. "I will never leave the wilderness again," she said softly. "Is my home. You are my home." The man's face didn't change, but Martha saw relief in his eyes. Ezra slowly walked over to her and with a simple gesture handed her a wooden medallion. It was months of work, 2 wolf figures intertwined, forever connected. He didn't say what he felt, but his eyes revealed everything. Martha took his hand, and together they watched the stars. No more words were needed. The wilderness had taught them that true bonds don't need unnecessary words. The following spring, an Indian trader brought a new story to Fort Laramie. He spoke of a lonely woodcutter living in the mountains who no longer lived alone. His companion was a brown-haired woman who handled an axe as skillfully as any man. They say they roam the forest together and sometimes help lost travelers. Several years later, one of the caravan members who hadn't stopped for Martha that cold dawn got lost in those same mountains. Half dead and vulnerable, he lay in the snow when a strong man and a brown-haired woman found him. They lifted him up, fed him, and took him to a warm cabin. The man recognized Martha, but she never reproached him. She only said that the wilderness teaches one forgiveness. The caravan that once abandoned Martha never learned that their cruelty ultimately led to the greatest gift. Where the wilderness's harshness and human kindness meet, a new beginning was born among the snow-covered mountains. Martha and Ezra's story became legend among the mountain people, a tale told on long winter evenings by the fire, reminding everyone that sometimes we find the brightest light in the deepest darkness.